Hello, everyone. I'll give it a few more minutes or just a minute or so because I see there's lots of people still joining right now. I'm looking at the attendance bar and I can see people are logging on. So I'll give them a few moments. But in that time, I can introduce myself. My name is Robin McMillan. I'm the innovator of projects, programs, and partnerships at the Canadian Child Care Federation. And I'm happy to be here with Caroline this evening. I'll be giving her an introduction in a moment, so I'll get into those details. And my colleague Suzanne from the Canadian Child Care Federation is here with me as well, and she's going to be doing a land acknowledgement for us. We're happy tonight to be providing this webinar to you on behalf of our sponsor at Wintergreen Learning Materials. They've generously provided us funding to do webinar series, and this is one of the ones that we're doing with that funding. What was the other thing I wanted to say? Yes, and we're also doing this as a series. We're doing a couple of webinars with the Speech, Language, and Audiology Canada as a partner, and they're bringing us their expertise to all of you, so we're really grateful for that. And hello, Suzanne. How are you tonight? Oh, unmute yourself.
Hi.
There we go.
And
Suzanne's
all coming well.
Yeah, she's coming all the way from Vancouver, so there we go, the other side of the country. And I'm going to ask Suzanne if you could start us out with a land acknowledgement that we do on behalf of the Canadian Child Care Federation, which is housed here in Ottawa. We're based in Ottawa, so that's why the land acknowledgement comes from here. But if you could do us the honor of expressing that tonight, that'd be great.
Absolutely. We respectfully acknowledge that the land on which the CCCF is located is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We recognize all Indigenous people who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As Indigenous people have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. Today, these lands continue to be shared territory and are occupied by many diverse peoples from near and far. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. That was lovely. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our expert from Speech, Language, and Audiology Canada, Caroline Erdos, PhD, SLP. She's a speech language pathologist and the coordinator of speech language pathology at Sir Wilfrid Laurier School Board and a speech and language advisor for the Speech, Language, and Audiology Canada. Previously, she was the Advancing Learning in Differentiation and Inclusion Coordinator for the 10 English school boards in Quebec, where she supported resource teachers through various professional development initiatives. With over 20 years of experience as a pediatric SLP, her areas of expertise include bi-multilingualism, reading and language disorder, FASD, and craniofacial differences. Caroline has lectured at several Canadian universities. She's also been invited to present at numerous conferences across North America and has written and collaborated on several publications. Hello, Caroline. Thanks for joining us this evening. And we're really looking forward to this webinar and teaching us a little bit more about oral language and oral language development in young children. So please take it away. I will turn off my camera, but I will be here. And I should note for attendees that you're on mute, but I will be looking in the chat and I can answer your questions there, and I can save some questions for Caroline at the end. And also, if you have any technical issues, you can just put them in the chat or the questions, and I'll address those. So I'm still here, but I'm going to be turning off my camera and muting myself, so all the attention will be on Caroline. So take it away, Caroline. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. The information that I bring to you today is strangely did not make it its way to my bio. I've worked for over 20 years in a pediatric hospital setting where I worked with children from neonates, very young, premature babies, all the way through young adulthood. I'm currently in a school board, but I have spanned different institutions, and I'm excited to be here today because as early childhood educators, you have such a golden opportunity to make a difference in the language development of young children. And my plan for today is to share with you, on the one hand, effective language stimulation strategies, but more specifically, the high leverage strategies that we know about because they have been researched. So there's many, many things we can do to stimulate language, but I'm most interested in sharing with you where you will have the biggest impact or the biggest bang for your buck, as some would say. Next, after the general language stimulation strategies, I will share with you this more specifically, the what and the how of some key language components. So, and these are phonological awareness, which I'm sure you have heard a lot about, but there are some important nuances there. Vocabulary, story structure, and comprehension of basic inferences. And we're going to try to leave time for a question period. Now, you should know that phonological awareness and a portion of story structure, which is dialogic reading, are upcoming sessions that will be presented to you. So those areas will not be fully delved into tonight. So firstly, with some effective language stimulation strategies. So a few general strategies that make a big difference. The first one is to place yourself at the child's height. So being face-to-face with a child really is a game changer in terms of the conversation, and more specifically in terms of the child's uptake of the language modeling that you are providing. So that's number one. The second point to emphasize that is supported by research evidence is that children will learn more from your language modeling if you are following the child's lead. That's super simple when stated, but more difficult to put into effect. That means that if a child is playing with something, even if the play is very basic, even if, you know, we're talking about just banging blocks together, you will get more from the child language-wise if you are talking about that than if you try to shift their interest to something else or another way of playing with those blocks. So you can do that to build play skills, but initially for language and for establishing that communication with the child, following the child's lead is what is best. And just by the way, children learn more from comments than they do from questions. So in addition to following the child's lead, you want to next comment on what the child is doing. Another strategy that is very interesting and is talked a lot about by, there's a language stimulation program called Hanen, and they've developed a lot of materials around this. And this is the idea of starting by copying the child's play and commenting on that, and then adding to their play and commenting on that. And this requires that you have two sets of whatever play the child is engaged in. So for example, if you have a child in the kitchen corner of your daycare room and the child is pretending to make soup, you would side by side with the child take a pot and pretend to make your own soup and possibly comment on that. And then after a few minutes, you might add something to that sequence. And for example, you might say, oh, I'm going to pour myself a bowl of that yummy soup. And now you talk about that. So this really engages children that you're starting exactly where they are, and only after a little bit of observation and commenting do you add something. It's very important to try to not get ahead of the child's needs, and to really count in your head at least to 10 to give them the time to formulate their comment or their question. Some children, especially children who are at risk for language delay or developmental delay, I'm thinking of children who, autistic children, for example, and children with developmental language disorder need a lot more time. And sometimes what happens is our waiting is too short, and they would have said something had we waited a little bit longer. And so the waiting time, just to give you a rule of thumb, is just about when you're starting to be uncomfortable. So it should be uncomfortably long for you, and that is probably perfect for the child. Another general strategy would be to avoid neutral responses. And here by neutral response, I mean a response that is unlikely to cause the child to add something like yes or that's right. If we say that to a child, that will almost surely end the conversation. So we want to avoid those types of responses, because you will see that we want to keep that exchange going with the child. Additional language stimulation strategies include, this first one is super important, maintaining the conversation for at least 4 turns. So there's a new information being published since a few years talking about serve and return. And this is where we're comparing this conversational turn taking to a game of tennis. And essentially we have some nice research coming out of the MIT lab showing us that, contrary to what we thought previously, children develop their language better when they have many opportunities to exchange with adults around them. We used to think that children who had more developed language skills were the children who heard more vocabulary in their lives. But in fact, it's not the amount of vocabulary, it's the amount of conversational exchanges. So the focus then should be, as much as possible, to keep that conversation going. And admittedly, that can be tricky in a group setting. You don't always have time to extend the conversation. But when you do, it could look like this. So the child comes over to you very excitedly and says, Laura, Laura, I got a cat. And then instead of just saying something like, oh, wow, a cat, that's fun, you could continue that conversation by saying, oh, you got a cat? Is it a big cat or is it a small cat? It's a small cat, he's just a baby. And then you can say something like, oh, he's a small cat. Those are so cute, and they're hard to find sometimes. They'll hide around the house. And did that happen to you? And so you're trying to keep that conversation going at least twice that the child took a turn. That is super valuable in terms of language development. Another important tip for language stimulation is that there is research showing that children will produce more varied language when they speak to other children. So try to find ways to get the children in your group to communicate with one another. So for example, by asking one child to ask the other child what color paper they would like. That could be a simple strategy to get them speaking with one another. There's also, and I'll talk about it later, I'm kind of preempting another point here, but having this children in situations where they are facing one another in their play will more easily promote that conversation between children. We want to also be thinking of asking fewer yes/no questions, because those are, just one-word answers and does not really give an opportunity to the child to practice formulating different types of sentences or different words. So fewer yes/no questions and fewer test questions. So what color, what shape, what is this, are generally questions where the child will answer with just one word. Rather than that, I would encourage you to ask open-ended questions. Oh, the boy stopped. Why do you think he stopped? Or where is he going? Depending on the level of the child, and we will talk about the WH questions and the order in which they develop, but try to go more for questions where the child will expand. And lastly, on this slide, one important strategy is to try to speak more slowly. We know that children will learn new vocabulary words better if we speak more slowly than if this new vocabulary word is embedded in a stream of speech that is more rapid. And the way to do this, it can be tricky because you want to slow down, but you don't want to sound, that kind of exaggerated slow speech. Instead, what I would recommend is that you simply pause more often. And so where there would be punctuation, if this were a written conversation, that's where you would pause for a few seconds. So where there would be a period, a comma, a question mark, you will simply take a 2 to 3 second pause. And that would be sufficient to slow down your speech rate while maintaining a natural rate. Now, these language stimulation strategies are used a lot by speech-language pathologists, and they are quite effective, and many early childhood educators use them as well. There are 4 different strategies in the same family of enriching the language of students and young children. There's commenting, so we talked about this, about commenting on what the child is doing. There's expansion, where you're fixing a piece of what the child said, either a grammatical piece or something with the pronunciation, or you're adding a word that was omitted. There's extension, where you're lengthening the production of the child by adding information. And there is reformulation, where you're reworking what they said to model a different verb or sentence type. I'll show you on the next slide some concrete examples of this. So for commenting, you might have a child playing in the kitchen corner, and you would simply comment, "Oh, that looks very hot. That soup is hot." For expansion, a child might say, "Baby Victor fall," and you can say, "Yes, baby Victor fell." And you would, with your intonation, emphasize the part that is being corrected. So you're not saying, "No, we don't say fall, we say fell." You're simply saying it back to them in a grammatical way and emphasizing the correction. That emphasis is necessary because otherwise children don't necessarily notice what the change is. So it needs to be highlighted somehow with your intonation. Extension would be a child saying, "Mommy's here," and you say, "Yes, mommy's here with your baby brother." So you're adding information. And reformulation, the child might say, "Doggy's all wet," and you say, "Yes, the dog is all wet because he played in a puddle." So you're now showing this child a new sentence construction, which is these 2 parts being brought together with the because. Many years ago, there was a lot of language stimulation that was happening where we were suggesting that it was very important to keep your model close to the child's model, and that in order to do that, sometimes the sentences had to be ungrammatical. So we would say things like, "Mommy do it," or "Baby go here." Whereas we have research now that has clarified for us that this is not a good idea. It is a good idea to have a language level that is close to the child's language level, but we should not be producing language that is not grammatical. So this, what used to be called telegraphic speech, and was something that we were telling families to do, is no longer supported by research evidence. So you would shorten your utterances, but at all times keep them grammatical. So we would say, "Mommy will do this," and "Victor goes to the store." So with the full grammatical endings, that's super important. And we want to always be close, and the way you know that you're close to the child's level is that you're only adding, if possible, 1 or 2 words or 1 or 2 corrections at a time. The last key tip on this slide is to avoid asking a child to repeat. And it's very tempting to say to a child, say, and then we're asking them to repeat a word that they had difficulty producing or a word that we have just taught them. That makes a lot of children do the opposite reaction, which is just to shut down and to not want to repeat. So rather than doing that, I'd like to, if you don't know this strategy, I'd like to teach you the freeze strategy, which is you provide the correct model and you pause and freeze. And you will see that the child, most likely, if you are not doing anything else, if you're not looking anywhere else, you've just modeled what you would like the child to say and you've left a pause, they will usually spontaneously repeat. So if, for example, the child says, aminal instead of animal, I would say, yes, animal. And then I'm just going to wait expectantly with the child. But if I don't do that, if I wait, but I look elsewhere or I move, some children, that's enough to lose their attention and they're now looking at what it is that you're doing with your hands or what it is that you're looking at. So this model, pause, and don't move at all, but look at them expectantly, they will usually produce what we are trying to get them to repeat. So without saying repeat this, they will repeat it with this strategy. Now, when it comes to more reserved children that are in your care, it's sometimes tricky to know how to address language stimulation with them. So one way to go is to just think out loud and kind of narrate what they're doing, leave a lot of spaces for them to speak. It may be that they need a lot of time to formulate their productions. So it may be that this child is more than just reserved. Maybe they have some language areas that are fragile and they need to find their words and structure what they want to say. You may also, when the child does speak, reformulate what they said so as to keep the conversation going. So that could be something if the child says, cars crash, you can say, oh, the cars are crashing into one another. And then you just wait. You don't want to move away from what they've indicated to you to be their topic of interest. You keep the conversation going by just saying differently what they just said. We want to be careful about the praise that we give these children. Some children who don't speak much, when they do, we get very excited and we kind of scare them away with that. I've been guilty of that so many times where I get very, very excited and then they kind of look at you like, oh my God, what have I done? So if we praise them, maybe very discreet kind of, a smile, a thumbs up, but not more than that, because many of these kids will shut down further if we bring attention to the fact that they spoke. I talked before about a preference for positioning children so that they are face-to-face. The other piece that goes along with that is that there is evidence that children will communicate more verbally with one another in smaller spaces. So if you can configure your room so that there are little corners in your room where only a few children can gather, you may find that leads to more language in those corners. When children are in big spaces without those smaller delineations, they tend to have louder play that is not necessarily filled with language per se. So you may try doing that and see how it goes. For the more reserved child, we would also consider pairing that child with a more talkative partner with the seating arrangement. And we could also try supplementing our discussions or exchanges with gesture and other visual supports. Some of those children, as I alluded to earlier, may be at risk for language issues, in which case the gesture, the visual supports, the pictograms, the little sketching like I show in this slide can be very helpful for them. Now, if there's been a communication breakdown, so you're having an exchange with a child and you don't understand what they've told you, or they're clearly very upset and they're verbalizing something and you don't understand what they're telling you, or you think you've understood but they're indicating by their response that that wasn't it. Here are a few strategies that you may put into place. Firstly, do not pretend to have understood. Most children are onto us. They can smell this from far. It's best not to pretend. It's best to say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Would you tell me again? You may want to provide an option based on a part that you did understand. So if you understood something outside, you might want to say, do you want to tell me about what happened outside? Is that what you're telling me? You might want to offer a choice. If you ask the child what they wanted from their snack and you didn't understand what they verbalized, you might now give them a choice. Do you want milk or juice? And start there. You could ask a closed question. In this case, it is a good idea to ask a yes/no question because that'll be clearer, and often there's the head nod that goes along with it. And you can request a clarification by saying, can you say that again, or could you show me? Many children are very good at showing us what they were trying to say. And so they might grab your hand and bring you somewhere, and that would be the way to attempt to repair a communication breakdown. We are now moving on to the key components of language, the first one being phonological awareness. So we have a whole session that is planned for you on phonological awareness, but this piece is very important, so I'm going to touch on it tonight as well. Phonological awareness is the bridge between oral and written language, and that's why it's such a big deal. It's how children get from speaking to speaking and reading and writing. This is a visual to help show that connection. So on the left hand bottom corner, you have talking, and right hand upper corner, you have reading and writing. And the arrow represents the chronology and the hierarchy of difficulty. We have here for syllable, I have a representation of a diving board with a child diving. And I'm using this analogy for syllables because the syllable level awareness, the syllable part of phonological awareness, is our diving board. Most children have the syllable awareness quite easily. This is another shift that has happened where we have been informed by research telling us that for many children, the syllable awareness is acquired, and that we need not expend too much time on that if it is acquired, because our target is the phonemic awareness. The individual sounds of words is where we need to go as educators as quickly as possible with the children, because this is the level at which we're making a difference in terms of their outcomes later with reading and writing. So if you have a child and they're able to blend and to segment syllables, then you would move on quickly to the phoneme level blending and segmenting, and we'll define those a bit better on the next slide. And you would continue that progression. At one point, when we're talking about the individual sound level, this is when letters get introduced, because then we make the bridge to written language and say to children, you know, that f in the word fish that we talked about, well, this is the letter that represents that. And so that's why there's an image of blue there, because it's the gluing of the letter to the sound that it makes that is what anchors letter sound knowledge, and which is the foundational skill for children's reading and writing. So just as an indication, this is the a chart representing the expectations for phonological awareness in children. So most children by 4 years of age will have acquired the syllable level work. They will be able to do that quite easily. So that means that you will give them the word elephant and you'll say, can you tap out the syllables in elephant? And they will be able to do elephant. Now, some children will do that and you'll say, so how many syllables? And they'll say 4. Now, that's an issue with counting and keeping track of one thing, one number. But the syllable awareness was well executed if they're tapping 3 times. So by the end of 4 years old, most children can do this easily with syllables. And by the end of 5 years of age, they can do this easily with individual sounds in words. And I think that is the part that's most interesting for you. You may have children who are at the extremes in terms of their abilities, and they're able to do this not only with individual sounds in words, but even tricky words that have 2 consonants side by side, like in the word stop, that st. The 2 consonants at the beginning of that word make it trickier for children. And so this is the overall picture. What's important to know is that phonological awareness is an oral language ability. So tapping out syllables, breaking apart the sounds in a word, I can do that orally. I don't need paper and pencil to do that. It's part of oral language. It is what it underlies all languages. And so if I know how to tap out syllables in English, I can tap out syllables in French and in Hungarian. It's an ability that is present cross-linguistically, which also means that you can mix the languages when you have children practice phonological awareness, and that will allow them to make gains, as well as to get all excited when they hear a word in their home language. So I wanted to highlight to you a short video that does just that, where you'll see that the teacher, in this case, the children are a bit older. They are kindergarten children, and they are, no, in fact, this group may even be older than that, and they are doing phonological awareness activities. And I'd like you to note that the teacher is presenting words in different languages. This video is in French, but just pay attention to the word that she's giving the student to perform a phonological awareness task with. Oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to remove.
Présenter un animal, la girafe. Maintenant, il t'amène un défi. Il t'amène de sonder des sons et des syllabes et même des rimes. Le fait de réaliser cette activité en utilisant les 3 langues permet aux enfants de prendre conscience que dans la plupart des langues, on peut utiliser les mêmes opérations cognitives sur les différentes unités. Il t'a présenté un animal, la girafe.
I'm sorry, you're not seeing the video.
Un défi.
Are you?
Il t'amène de sonder des sons et des syllabes et même des rimes. Le fait de réaliser cette activité en utilisant les 3 langues permet aux enfants de prendre conscience que dans la plupart des langues, on peut utiliser les mêmes opérations cognitives sur les différentes unités. Ils sont davantage en mesure de faire alors des liens avec leurs habiletés et leurs connaissances, et ce en ce qui concerne la photo. Il t'a présenté un animal, la girafe. Maintenant, il t'amène un défi. Il t'amène de sonder des sons et des syllabes et même des rimes. Le fait de réaliser cette activité en utilisant les 3 langues permet...
Hmm. I'm sorry, I think that the video is not playing.
Yes, we saw a video. We saw it at first with the woman with the younger children, and then her voice kept going, but then we saw the other video instead. So they just got a bit mixed up. I'm not sure why, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry about that. So I will just explain this to you. So they're going around and they're having to count out the syllables in a word. And so the first child is given the word, for example, banana, and the child says banana, and she says, great job. Okay, now pour toi, éléphant in French. So the child, éléphant. And then next child, it was in Portuguese, obrigado. So now the child's counting out the syllables in a Portuguese word. So the point being that the teacher continues to speak the same language, in this case French, but the words that the children are manipulating for the phonological awareness activities are in different languages, and they are the different languages that are spoken by the children in that class. That type of activity is very rich because it shows children that you are coming to this with a lot of skills. You speak a different language at home, and that language works the same way. So I encourage you to use these types of what's called translanguaging tasks to communicate that message to your students. You're going to see their little eyes light up if you just pick up one word or two in their language and use that in an activity. So maybe in the case of your students, you want them to move. So maybe you have hula hoops on the ground and they're jumping through the hula hoops with words in different languages. So that's just something I wanted to share with you. Okay, so the rest of the phonological awareness will be discussed in an entire session that will be devoted to phonological awareness. We're now moving on to vocabulary. Vocabulary is key for oral language development. It's so important in so many instances. It's important to follow instructions. It's important to understand a story. It's important to get your basic needs met. And so we need to think a lot about how we're going to make sure that new vocabulary words stick for your students. So we're looking for highly engaging activities. We're looking for, firstly, when we introduce the new vocabulary, to activate their prior knowledge about that area. So this is where working in terms of themes of vocabulary can be very helpful, because we're going to, let's say you're talking about toys. So, and that's the category that you're using. We're going to activate a conversation about what toys they have at home, what their favorite toys are, etc., before introducing new vocabulary. We're going to want to teach that vocabulary through all the different senses. So we're going to have them see the item. We're going to want them to hear it if it's something that makes a sound. If it's something that's food related, we might want them to smell the item. We're going to use gesture and maybe mime how we use the item. If we're thinking of a cup, for example, I might mime that. We're going to use kinesthetic senses in terms of movement and getting them to maybe dance or learn a song that incorporates that vocabulary. We want to provide definitions that they can easily understand, but most importantly, we want to provide many activities and opportunities for them to reuse those new words. And that's the tricky part, is getting them to say the words. So we're very good at feeding in the vocabulary, but we're kind of not as good at finding ways to get the words to be used by the children. And finally, we also don't always think about the highlighting similarities and differences across languages, and that's a very strong way to anchor vocabulary for children. So if you know that the word is similar across languages, to highlight that to children can be very helpful. Here I had another video. We'll try it, and if we have the same glitch, I'll just share the ideas with you instead. video is in French, but I will explain it after.
Elle est petite. Alors, je vais éliminer des objets de la table et toi, tu devras me dire ce que c'est.
I think we're having the same issue. That's unfortunate because that's the fun part is in action, but maybe you can watch it on your own if you have a minute. Even if you don't speak French, the ideas in here speak for themselves. They're great little tricks. So for example, the teacher teaches them vocabulary as she's working on, utensils, plates, cups, glasses, etc. That's the vocabulary that is being focused on. She places these items on a table in front of the children and then removes one of those items and then has them figure out which one was missing. Then she takes out a small flashlight and says, okay, now we're going to use the flashlight. So she lights up one of the items and the children have to name the item that was lit up. And she does this with the whole class. And then once they know how the game works, she puts them in little groups, gives one person a little flashlight, and they have a set of objects. And there are 3 kids at the table. One's holding the flashlight. One is the child who keeps track of what is happening in terms of which one is being lit and waits, and one names. So they take turns. I'm not explaining this well, I'm sorry. They take turns lighting up an object, and then one child names which object is lit up, and then they pass the flashlight around. And just that little activity gets them so engaged, it's crazy, and they're all using the vocabulary. Then they have another activity where she has a bag, they pick an object out of the bag, the child who's picking brings it close enough to his face to see what it is without showing the others, and then mimes the object. And the children have to guess what the child is miming, which object the child touched in the bag. And so they're all screaming the different vocabulary words that they learned. That's another strategy that they're using. There's another one where they have a sheet with pictures of those objects. They each have that sheet, and the child who is giving the instructions is not showing his partner his sheet, but is saying, I want you to circle the cup, and the other child has to execute what has been requested. So the goal is simply to have the one child produce a sentence with that word. And it's just a bunch of little activities like this that make the children reinvest those vocabulary words. And I wanted to share that with you because that's the hard part, is to get the children to use the words. And there are more ideas in there than I'm giving it justice, but if you could watch the video, you'll see that it's worth the time to watch it. Vocabulary can also very nicely be developed through book reading. It's an excellent way to build vocabulary. There's a specific strategy for book reading that you may have heard of called dialogic reading. This is another one of our upcoming sessions together, entirely devoted to dialogic reading. Essentially, dialogic reading is a way of reading books with children where they're participating throughout. So before, during, and after reading the story, the child is involved, the children are involved. In dialogic reading, you could target as many as 4 to 6 new words per book. And the way that dialogic reading works is that there's a focus on the types of prompts that you're using during this reading. And more specifically, the prompts are listed here, where you have prompts that are called sentence completion prompts. So the idea is you're reading the book and you're planting these specific questions as you're going along. So sentence completion might be, if you're reading the 3 pigs, you might say, he huffed and he puffed and he. So now we're waiting for the children to complete the sentence. then you specifically also include recall prompts, which is, do you remember what the second house was made of? So this is used only when the children have heard the story before, but it's another type of prompt. Then we have open questions. What do you think is going to happen next? That would be an open question. Closed questions. Do you think the wolf is a good wolf or a bad wolf? That's a closed question. And then lastly, we try to connect the book to the child's prior experience. So have you ever seen a pig in real life? And so dialogic reading really is a way of reading to children where you're systematically including these 5 types of prompts. It's been researched, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that this makes a difference in terms of language development for children, for both vocabulary development and grammatical development. And so this is why we're going to have a focus on this, because it's such a powerful strategy for language building. We also have story structure that is an important part of language development, and I wanted to talk about this because this is something that we don't see or hear a lot about in daycare settings, yet the daycare children can very much benefit from this. And this is the idea that when you know how stories work and when you know what the recurring parts of stories are, you become better at understanding stories, you become better at producing stories, and having knowledge of this structure also helps you better remember what you have learned through these stories. And using visuals that we call graphic organizers can really help you learn that structure very easily. And so what I'm talking about here is a visual like this, for example, for narratives, where after reading a narrative story to students and children, you would use a visual like this and say, okay, let's try to remember this story that we read. Where did it take place? And then you point to the visual of setting. And then they say, it was on a farm. Great, you're right, it was on a farm. And you might fill in a sketch of a farm in this first quadrant. And then who was in the story? Because now we're prompting them for the characters of the story. And they tell you, and you might sketch these in. And then, oh, but what was the problem in this story? Because we know that narratives always have some type of a problem, and etc. And doing this after telling a story is teaching kids the structure of that narrative. And so you might start with this blank graphic organizer, and you have the links on this slide to access these. And then you might fill it out together in this way as they're answering the questions about the story. And that's something that children can do very easily. 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds can do this easily. For younger children, it would be much more basic. So for younger children, maybe we're just talking about beginning, middle, and end for stories, but also maybe for activities in their day. So maybe we're going to think back or plan, either way, a pumpkin activity, a pumpkin artwork activity. So first we cut out the pumpkin. What are we going to do next? Well, we're going to glue the eyes on the pumpkin. And what are we going to do next? Well, we're going to glue the mouth on the pumpkin. So maybe we're first teaching them just a 3-step activity. And at some point we're going to start talking about beginning, middle, and end of stories in the same way. And this younger children at 3 years of age, we can start talking in these terms, and they can very much handle that. And lastly, we have inferences. Again, something that we don't hear about a lot in child care settings, but super important because many children struggle with inferences, and that is using what you know and new information and linking them together. So for example, you might be reading a story, and in the story, someone is taking their umbrella with them, and you would ask the children, do you think that it's sunny outside, or do you think that it's raining? And some children will get that and say it's raining. Why? Because the man took his umbrella, or because Winnie took the umbrella. But other children will miss that completely. So to make those kinds of connections explicit is very helpful to children. So to say, oh, it must be raining because Winnie took his umbrella, that's right. Why else would he take an umbrella? We use an umbrella when it rains. And so that's something to open up that thinking about those links that we make almost automatically is how children learn to make inferences. And similarly, if I jump to the bottom of this slide, another type of inference is pronouns, right? So in a story, you might, read something, Jacob is hungry, he eats a sandwich. You could stop and ask, who is he? To make sure that the children are all still on track about the fact that we're still talking about Jacob, that character in the story that we saw in the first picture, for example. Those are things that are worth highlighting as you're reading stories. And related to that is questions, and the fact that questions are quite abstract, and they're tricky to grasp for some children. The most accessible types of questions are the what, who, and where questions. So think of the questions where you can point to something as the answer. Those are very easy to understand. And the more complex questions are the when, the why, and the how. Those develop later, and it can take until school age to fully understand these questions. But most children have a good basic sense of these by the time they start school. And so here we are at the end of what I wanted to share with you tonight. And this is a handout that we will also be sending out to you with a reminder of some do's and don'ts in terms of language stimulation in young children. So you see here reiterated many of the points that we made along the last hour. So I think there's a few minutes for questions. I'd be happy to do that.
I noted. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was so informative and so full of practical strategies that I think are amazing to provide to our audience, because they can use them tomorrow. They can go back to their centers and use them right away with the children that they work with. There was a couple of questions I pulled out that perhaps you could touch upon. One was, how do we support non-speaking 2 to 3-year-olds?
By imitating what they're doing. So similar strategies, imitating also what they're producing as sounds. That's always super interesting to very young children who just mum, 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 and you stop and you do what they're doing and mum, mum, and you wait, and they'll be interested in that. They'll kind of pay attention to that. You want to use gesture with them, because the hope is that if the words are too difficult, that they'll pick up some of the gesture. So when you're speaking to them and you want to take a turn, you'll say, my turn, and you'll be tapping on yourself, or we're going to eat now. We're using a lot of these same gestures repeatedly with them, so that they can maybe start using some of those. And contrary to what you might fear, gestures do not delay language development. There is research telling us that there is no research that has ever shown a delay, and if anything, some of the research is showing that maybe it provides a boost to use gesture. So go ahead and use as much natural gesture as you can with those children, because that's going to be a useful strategy for them.
Oh, that's a great point. And I was happy you brought that up, because my son had a severe speech and language disorder, and I used a lot of gestures. And I remember people saying to me, often pulling me aside and even saying, you shouldn't really be doing that. And I said, no, actually, I should be doing that, because that is something that everyone can do, and it's quite easy to do and comes quite naturally, I think, for a lot of us as early childhood educators, because we do tend to gesture quite a bit. So it's a great idea, and it's actually really helping the children when you do that. So thanks for mentioning that.
100%,
Yeah.
and make sure not to get ahead of that child's needs. So we want to really wait for them to indicate somehow with a grunt, with a gesture, what they want, but try even harder with those children not to be there kind of filling in the gaps.
Oh, for sure. And then I had another question. Which group of children can we apply language strategies? Well, I think you probably answered that, but I think people were asking, you know, with the different age differences, but really, as you said, with all ages, I mean, these strategies are useful, just in different ways.
Yes, just the story structure, as I indicated, is a bit later. So around 3 for the beginning, middle, end, and then the fuller story structure, that's more for 4 and 5, and the inferences. But all of the beginning section, that's all for very young to 5-year-olds.
Great. So I have one more question I'm going to pull from here. What is your belief on using visuals with children that seem to be delayed in speech?
On using visuals like pictograms?
I think, or maybe for schedules, or for getting them to encourage their speech development.
I think visuals are fantastic because they're another means, they're an alternative means of communication. So just like the gesture, they serve as a bridge to communication. So I also, you know, there's evidence telling us that even autistic students who are verbal but not as verbal as their peers, if you introduce AAC, alternative and augmentative communication, so using a computer with pictures to communicate, or just a cardboard with the pictures on it, that allows them to produce so much more. And now they're communicating everything they want to communicate. So I think it's a great idea to use picture supports, and the visual schedules. The routine is so important to children, and especially children who have language delays, because their environment is unpredictable in that the words don't mean as much. So if they can see what's coming up, you've said it, but it may have gone over their heads because their language is not yet developed, to also see what's coming up and what the day will be like is very reassuring to them. So
Very much
always
so.
a good idea.
Yes, for sure. And I also wanted just to thank you for giving us all these strategies, and as well introducing us to some terminology like I noted down fragile language areas, because I thought that was a really nice thing to hear from, actually, as a parent for a child who had speech and language disorder, but also as a practitioner when I worked frontline. I thought that is a nice way of talking about that, like a really respectful way of talking about that, instead of always talking about it as sort of a negative, but saying there are actually fragile language areas in children and how they develop, and they just develop at different times like they do with everything else. But it's to kind of treat them with care and to be more what's the word I'm trying to use? Intentional, I think, with what we're trying to do, you know. And I think that's a really good point, because often we forget that they are actually fragile language areas, that they're just developing. So we need not step on them or talk over them or any of those things that you said. So this is a great resource sheet that we have at the end of our session here, which will be sent out with the follow-up email. So I want to include that. And yeah, I think that ties it up. Again, thank you so much for giving us these really practical strategies which can be implemented right away, which I know people are excited about. I had several people telling me how they were madly taking pictures of all the slides and writing copious notes, and I said, no, it's okay, that you'll be getting all this stuff in an email. So I did tell them that early on. So there will be an email that follows up with this, that you'll be getting additional resources like this wonderful sheet at the end of Caroline's webinar, plus the slides, the actual slides you're going to be getting as well. And then you'll also have a link to the webinar. So, and there's some more resources there. So you'll be seeing all of that in your follow-up email. So not to worry, you've got lots of additional information coming. And as well, to let you know, I know some people have been asking about certificates. The certificates are sent out in a separate email, so that you'll be getting 2 emails as follow-up for this. One will be the follow-up email with the information from this webinar, the slides, additional resources, plus a very quick evaluation, if you could do that for us to tell us what you thought, give us your feedback, and then the replay link that's on our YouTube channel. But you'll be getting a second as well, you'll be getting a second email that will be from Certifier, and that will be your certificate. But just to note, if you want to get your certificate, you have to watch the live webinar. So if you pass this on to colleagues, which we encourage you to do, and you get the slides, unfortunately, if they didn't participate in the live webinar, they will not be able to get the certificate, the professional development certificate. And
But they
also,
have the French one next week, right?
yes, that's right. There'll be information about all that coming up in the email as well. We'll follow up. We are doing these webinars, this webinar series in French and English. So be sure to tell your French colleagues there's an opportunity to do this in French as well. And with the certificate, I know people are very anxious to get those, but just so you know, sometimes they actually go into a junk or your spam folder. So please be sure to check your junk and spam folders and give us a few days to get those out. So I would say if you don't receive those within a week, then for sure let us know, and then we will follow up with you on that. And as well, you get certificates if you've registered individually for the webinar. So if you're watching with some colleagues, you'll have to actually send me an email, because you will not be sent a certificate unless you're registered as an individual for this event. So I put the email address where I can be reached at the bottom. It's webinars, plural, at CCCF-FCSGE.ca. So I will have that in the email as well. And if you have any questions, you can follow up with that. So thank you very much, Carolyn. Thanks for joining us. And we will be seeing you again with our next webinar. And we'll have more information on that coming up, and registration information as well. So thanks again to everyone for joining us this evening. And we hope that this gets you off and running and how to encourage language development in young children. So thank you and have a good night.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.